Good morning. Who likes parties? A lot of people, just about everybody. So I assume that most of us have been to a party, so we know that there are lots of different kinds. There are retirement parties and birthday parties. There's even celebrations of life for lives well lived that have come to an end. And usually there's one person or a group of people that are kind of the center of the party that are being recognized and honored. And parties, they're a great way to do that. They could be to recognize an achievement like a graduation or a promotion. Could be a way to celebrate a blessing like a new baby or a birthday or a baptism. Maybe it's a way to celebrate a different kind of blessing, like maybe the hard-fought remission of a disease. Maybe there's food at the party, maybe there's music and dancing, or maybe this is the kind of party where the idea is just to spend time with the people that you love. There are a million different reasons to have a party. But what happens once the party's over? Life goes back to normal. In the peaks and valleys that we encounter in this life, we sometimes see the celebration itself as the pinnacle, and then we descend the other side of that hill, and it's back to everyday life. So Pastor Justin can't be the only one who quotes famous poets during his sermons, and I thought of one for this one that embodies this idea pretty well when he said, "Turn out the lights, the party's over. They say that all good things must end. Call it a night, the party's over, and tomorrow starts the same old thing again." Today's Palm Sunday, a celebration, maybe even the celebration. It's often called Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and it wasn't just any old parade where the people celebrated and then it was back to the way things had always been. This celebration was different, and we're still feeling the effects of it now. And here's what happened. In the time leading up to Palm Sunday, Jesus and his disciples were on their way to Jerusalem for the Passover festival, and they were taking some breaks along the way to do some of the things that Jesus did often, like performing miracles, answering questions with questions, and to share some parables. So we come to today's story in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, verses 28 through 40, and this is how it goes. After Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' say, 'The Lord needs it.'" Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as they had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" They replied, "The Lord needs it." They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he replied, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." So at the beginning of our reading, Jesus tells his disciples to go to the next town over and find a donkey. And this is because Jesus isn't a typical king. Jesus rules his kingdom with humility, grace, and love, while other kings, other emperors, they ruled their empires with tyranny and fear. Jesus did not enter Jerusalem on the back of a white steed with his sword drawn, victoriously leading a train of war spoils. He entered Jerusalem on a donkey, not even a fully grown donkey, sitting on his friend's clothes. But the people treated him as if he were a king. They saw his humility, and they still recognized Jesus as his king, even though he didn't look or act like the kind of king that they were used to. The people treated him like he was a king because he was a king. But I can't even say he was a king. That's not a fair thing to say. It's not true to say that the parade of Palm Sunday ended on Palm Sunday. There's more to this story than Jesus just riding into town while the people cheered. It's even possible for us to get the wrong idea about Palm Sunday. As we enter Holy Week, it's easy to think of Palm Sunday as Jesus' last hurrah before Maundy Thursday, the night he was betrayed, or to think of Good Friday, the day that Jesus took his final breath. But Palm Sunday is a day to be celebrated every day. Jesus allowed himself to be proclaimed as king, which finally exposed him to those who wanted to kill him. Up until now, Jesus had managed to legitimize himself to his enemies, exerting just enough influence over his followers and yet not technically doing anything wrong or illegal even. He never allowed anyone to proclaim his kingship publicly, but today was the day. He allowed it to happen, and he invited the consequences that came with it. He made no argument against his disciples, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." He let it happen, which is something that he hadn't done up until this point. But more than just allowing it to happen, Jesus actually orchestrated this whole thing himself. First of all, by riding into the holy city on the back of a donkey's colt, he fulfilled a prophecy that comes from Zechariah 9:9. And it says, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly, and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Jesus purposely chose that moment, knowing that the Jewish people would recognize the prophecy and recognize him as king. And in order to fully wrap our arms around the story of Palm Sunday, I just really want to drive home the point that there are no coincidences in this story. This was God's plan all along. We could sit back now and say things like, well, what if the donkey wasn't there? Or what if Jesus had rebuked his disciples? But we can't think like that because every step was carefully planned out for things to turn out exactly the way they did. And Jesus hinted about this throughout his entire ministry, and we see throughout the rest of the New Testament that even the disciples really only understood this in hindsight. It was all pre-planned. The prophecy had been planted with Zechariah 500 years earlier, but there were other things too. Things like Jesus knew there would be a colt. He knew exactly where it would be. He knew exactly what to say to the people who owned it when he needed to borrow it. And he knew that the people of Jerusalem were finally ready to receive him as their king. Jesus knew this was going to happen. But more importantly, he knew it needed to happen. It had to happen. And he allowed it to play out to the perfect end. So Jesus himself even explains this in a very Jesus way, that the events of that day were perfectly inevitable. The Pharisees tell Jesus that he needs to rebuke his followers, tell them to stop proclaiming that he's king, because the Pharisees know that this will look like rebellion to the Romans. And Jesus knows this too. But what the Pharisees don't understand is that this act of rebellion has to happen so that the chain of events that followed would ultimately culminate in Jesus' death and thereby his resurrection. Jesus responds to the Pharisees by saying, "I tell you, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." I don't know about you, but I have a hard time wrapping my mind around this idea that if the followers hadn't said that Jesus was king, the inanimate objects would. That's the degree to which this celebration must happen. Jesus is king, no matter how the events shake out. But Palm Sunday is supposed to be if Palm Sunday is supposed to be a celebration, why is it all so confusing when we consider what happened in the week following? The people who celebrated Jesus' kingship were the same people that demanded his execution just 5 short days later. Our human minds hear the story of Palm Sunday and we misconstrue the importance of it. It's too easy for us to think of Palm Sunday as the beginning of the end. To borrow from another story from the Bible, we think of Jesus as walking into the lion's den on Palm Sunday. But the story of Daniel is lost if the story ends when Daniel's thrown into the lion's den, because what happens? God rescues him from the lion's den. And just the same way, when we look at Palm Sunday as an isolated event and say, well, this is the event that eventually leads to his death, we kind of miss the point. So if we look at Palm Sunday as the beginning of the end, we can't do that. Palm Sunday is the big reveal. It's when the curtain lifts on the opening scene of the greatest love story ever told. So with most parties, like the kind we talked about earlier, life goes back to normal when it's over. Back to the same old thing. But with the celebration of Palm Sunday, we celebrate because life doesn't go back to normal. The world was changed in unimaginable ways in the days that followed Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. And stay tuned over the next week to find out how the story goes. But hold this posture of celebration in your heart throughout, even when the story gets to its darker points. So as we come to our time of prayer this morning, let's take some time to consider that Palm Sunday isn't the beginning of the end, it's the beginning of the beginning. Jesus allows himself to be present anyway because it sets the stage for the greatest act of love that we will ever see, and that's something worth celebrating. Palm Sunday isn't a funeral procession, it's a party, and Jesus is king. So as we sing our call to prayer, consider this question. We've talked about why Palm Sunday was important 2,000 years ago, but what I want you to think about is, why is it important now?